Welcome to our Victoria Law Foundation Research Network event on the hidden legal crisis in rental housing, coming to you today from the City Library in Melbourne with Hannah Gray from Tenants Victoria and our own Dr. Hugh McDonald, Research Director at the VLF. I'm Lynn Holtain, I'm the Exec Director at the VLF, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us for this conversation. Just a little bit of background on the Research Network. It's a quarterly gathering showcasing the latest research and new ideas in access to justice and legal needs developments, bringing together people from justice, from the community sector, and from the academic world as well to share knowledge and to build collaboration between us all. And our session today will explore the critical link between housing insecurity and legal need through two important pieces of relatively new research. New analysis of data from the VLF's Public Understanding of Law survey, which has been out for a while, but the housing work is currently in train, and also from Tenants Victoria's Restricted, Resilient, Resourceful, Legal Help Seeking Among Single Parent Renters, which is a really interesting piece of work that Hannah Gray has led, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. Everyone deserves timely access to support for their legal issues, but the demand for free legal services, as you would be well aware, often outweighs capacity, making it really difficult for people to get the support that they need. In the report, Restricted, Resilient, Resourceful, Tenants Victoria, in partnership with Council of Single Mothers and Their Children, spoke to 19 single parents about the challenges they must overcome to find housing, address their rental issues, and seek support through the legal, community, and government services available to them. We'll hear a lot more about this in a moment or two, but the research found that amongst the 19 research participants, the high cost of renting and a perception among single parents that they were not ideal applicants made them hesitant to assert their rights as renters. 89% of participants had experienced 3 or more legal problems. 69% described raising an issue with their real estate agent or landlord, and they're not pushing further when it wasn't addressed. And we'll talk about where these insights take us shortly. But first, the VLF officers stand on Wurundjeri land, unceded land, and I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians, recognising their abiding connection to this land, its waterways and community. It's my privilege to pay respects to their elders and to all the generations who've nurtured this land for over 60,000 years and continue to do so. We believe that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a better, more equitable future. We recognise the impact of colonisation, its legacy of injustice, and the marginalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We aim to break down the barriers to justice for all Victorians through our work in research, education, and grants. We are committed to making a sincere and positive contribution to a better justice system for all of us, and especially those who are vulnerable and in most need. As I mentioned, we are at the City Library in Melbourne today via Zoom. So as a result, there is a Q&A function which is available to you, and we look forward to your questions in that Q&A function, or you can upvote other questions that you might see that you're also keen to hear answered. So please take an opportunity to use that, and we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can at the end. The way we're going to structure this is our two panelists will present their key data and findings for about 10 minutes each. And we also have a short video, which I'm really looking forward to sharing with you, that we'll position in the middle between our two presentations. So let me introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Hugh McDonald joined the VLF in September 2019 as Principal Researcher and became our Research Director in August 2024. Before that, he was a Senior Researcher at the Law and Justice Foundation in New South Wales, where he worked on critical projects in access to justice, legal needs and service evaluation, including, importantly in this context, the Legal Australia-wide or LAW survey that some of you would be familiar with. Throughout his career, Hugh has worked closely with legal aid commissions, with community legal centres, and state and federal governments, giving him a deep understanding of legal institutions and the issues that prevail in these contexts throughout the country. Since joining the VLF, Hugh has led the data mapping and the Community Legal Centre workforce projects, as well as working very closely with Professor Nigel Balmer on the Public Understanding of Law survey. Hannah Gray is a senior researcher at Tenants Vic. She has a strong background in research focused on legal and community service responses to renters, people experiencing homelessness, those affected by or at risk of family violence, and the LGBTIQ+ community. She has a passion for developing projects through collaborative research in the government and not-for-profit sectors, leading research that interrogates the complex pathways to justice and housing stability. In her role at Tenants Vic, Hannah has been instrumental in policy development and research, including approaches to elevate renter voices through qualitative research, implementing renter feedback processes to capture deeper insights into service experiences, and creating visual tools that map the help-seeking journeys of renters. And I'm sure we'll hear much more about many of those dimensions very soon. But I think we'll start with you, Hugh. Would you like to start your presentation and give us an insight into what Pulse tells us about this experience?
Sure. Thanks very much, Lynn. Today I am excited to share some new analysis from the Public Understanding of Law survey, or Pulse, the dataset, looking at how legal need varies by housing status. I'll talk about the variable we used, and we'll look at the findings for renters and the nature of the legal problems they experience. And given Hannah's presentation to follow, I'll also briefly mention some of what we know about single parents. Spoiler alert, they experience more housing problems. As many of you will be aware, but certainly not all, the Pulse surveys both legal need and legal capability. It's got several measures of legal need not previously used in Australia and a series of measures of legal capability to examine the experience, handling, resolution of the types of everyday legal problems widely experienced across the community. Yet these can also be problems that can be amongst the most serious and transformative experience of people's lives, and can have really wide-ranging consequences. The Pulse was a face-to-face probability sample of 6,008 adult Victorians. People were invited to participate using a random sample of Victorian households. So this survey method means that the findings are representative for the population. But for the analysis here today, it's important to note that the survey was not designed to survey primary homelessness. People such as rough sleepers and people in unconventional or makeshift accommodations that do not have a recognised residential address. Those are people that population surveys typically miss. But the survey does include people who were living or temporarily living at someone else's house, such as someone who might have been couch surfing, a recognised form of secondary homelessness. Other research methods can and have studied the legal needs of people experiencing homelessness. But the Pulse is a unique data set, and it provides information from a truly unique point of view. So it captures the real world lived experience of what different types of issues people experience, what they do and don't do about them, what happens, and what people achieve when they experience justiciable problems. So their problems, a problem or a dispute where the law and the justice system has a role to play and can potentially be invoked in achieving a solution or resolution. So to examine the relationship between housing status and legal need, we used a variable in Pulse that recorded the respondents' housing circumstances. So specifically, whether they owned their home outright, so that's owned without a mortgage, whether they were on a mortgage or a loan. So that's people under a mortgage or under some form of loan arrangements. It also captured whether someone was renting publicly from a public housing or other community or social housing, or whether they were a private renter, so renting from a private landlord. It also captured some people who were living rent-free. So this is people who are living with the owners or renters. It can include some other precarious forms of residency. It might be adults living rent-free with parents. It might be someone bunking down with friends for a bit. It can be younger people living with their parents. So overall, in amongst the Pulse respondents, 38% of respondents owned their home outright. Just over a quarter owned it with a mortgage or a loan. 28% were renting privately. There were 4% who were public renters and 4% who were also living rent-free. So looking here at this slide, you can see the overall prevalence of justiciable problems. You can see that it varies a bit by housing status. So we can see that mortgagees and renters both have higher prevalence, with around 50% of respondents in these groups reporting one or more justiciable problems within the 2 previous years before the survey. By comparison, the finding for the Pulse respondents overall was a prevalence rate of 42%. So those who owned their home outright and those living rent-free had lower prevalence, with just over 1 in 3 reporting a justiciable problem. The figure here also sets out the experience of housing problems. That's in orange. You can see that the prevalence of housing varied dramatically, or more dramatically than prevalence overall. And it was highest amongst renters, with more than 1/4 of public renters and nearly 1/5 of private renters experiencing a housing-related legal problem or dispute. Delving into the types of problems, the broader type of problems that people experienced. We can see variation again by housing status. So the red shading here shows the types of problems that people in different housing status categories experience at higher rates. So you can see a bulk of the red falls on public and private renters, who both had higher prevalence of 6 out of the 10 legal problem types canvassed in Pulse. So public renters had higher prevalence of housing, family, government payment, debt and money, injury, and government and public services. In addition to having higher prevalence of housing problems, private renters also had higher prevalence of fines and employment problems, and like public renters, also had higher prevalence of family, government payment, and debt or money problems. This side's a bit busy, but what we've done here is we've broken down the different types or subtypes of housing problems that were canvassed in Pulse. And as we'd expect, the nature of the housing problems that people experienced reflected their housing status. So we can see that those who own their home outright or under a mortgage have higher prevalence of problems related to owned housing. That makes sense. While we can see that renters have higher prevalence of rented housing related problems. But we can also see there's a difference between public and private tenants. Overall, the most common type of housing related problem that renters experience, that's for both public and private, concerned repairs, maintenance or security of their rented housing. Private renters more frequently experience problems or disputes over rental agreements, bonds and rental payments than public housing tenants. But public renters more often experience problems or disputes with harassment by a landlord or the transfer of that tenancy. Problems or disputes involving neighbours were most frequently a type of problem, housing related problem experienced by homeowners. Just interestingly enough here, while we saw earlier a relatively lower prevalence of housing-related problems amongst those who were living rent-free, those living rent-free most commonly reported problems with repairs, maintenance or security problems and harassment by a landlord, suggesting that these respondents, although they were currently living rent-free, had previously been living in rented housing. And this points to these problems may well have contributed to their current housing situation or a change in their status. Turning to look at what people do about their justiciable problems, we again see strong variation here by housing status. So looking at the strategies adopted, we can see that those who do nothing at the highest rate were the people living rent-free. They did this for 9% of their problems, so it's notably higher than the respondents who owned their housing. Roughly 20 to 30% of problems were handled alone by all respondents, although public renters and those living rent-free less often handled their problems alone. Informal help from family and friends was higher for those living rent-free. Again, that makes sense if you think about people living with other people owning or paying rent. And then when we look at the use of legal services, what jumps off the page here is that public renters and those living rent-free use a legal service at far higher rates. So for public renters, nearly half of their justiciable problems and more than 1/3 of the problems experienced of those living rent-free had or resulted in the use of a legal service. Just beginning to wrap up by looking at whether legal need was met or not. So while we just saw that public renters use legal services at the highest rates, the slide here shows that they had a substantially higher level of unmet legal need. So in fact, 75% of the justiciable problems experienced by public renters resulted in an unmet legal need, with private renters having the next highest rate of unmet legal need, 53% of all problems. We've previously, in the Pulse analysis, we've previously pointed to a mismatch that Pulse reveals between what many people need to effectively handle and resolve their legal problems and what they're getting out of the justice system. The findings here shows that renters fare far worse than others. So just a couple of quick takeaways. Legal need, it varies by housing status. While renters had the highest rate of housing-related problems, they don't just have housing problems, they also experience higher rates of many other types of problems and have higher legal prevalence overall. The type of housing problems they most frequently experience concern repairs, maintenance or security of their rented housing. But as public renters that stand out as the housing status with the highest prevalence of justiciable problems overall and of housing problems. And while they had the highest rate of advice from legal services, they also had the highest level of unmet legal need. Private renters fare a bit better than public renters, although they used legal services at the lowest rate. And after public renters, they had the next highest rate of unmet legal need. So just quickly turning to some of what we know about single parents. Again, and following what you've just seen, the pattern is reasonably familiar. Justiciable problem prevalence varies by family status. So single parents experience higher prevalence overall. They also experience higher rates of family, government payment, debt and money, and importantly today, housing problems. Single parents more frequently did nothing in response to their justiciable problems. 7% of problems compared to only 4% of the respondents overall. And single parents also had higher rates of unmet legal need, again, much higher than other types of family status. So similar to renters, as we've just seen, the findings make perfect sense in that many single parents will be and fall into that renter cohort. That's me.
Thank you, Hugh. I think the consistency between the big data set of Pulse and what we are shortly to hear from Hannah in terms of her qualitative work is quite striking, and we'll hear more about that experience of single parents and their rental experience from Hannah and the data in just a moment. But before we do that, we have a short video to play for you, which is Macy Chaudhry, who was one of the participants in Hannah's research and is a single mother who has had some significant rental problems. Let's see that video.
So when I got that letter, I was just bewildered completely, thinking how I'd afford that rental increase. So I started with Googling things, simple things, rental dispute, just going off the language that they'd used in the letter, and Tenants Victoria came up, and I was met with such a lot of compassion and empathy. I was really inspired about understanding about rental law and rental law reforms. What can I do to sort of demystify legal jargon and help others? I think lived experience expertise is able to quickly highlight the pain points of any system, because I think sometimes they look at the matter based on what they can read on a piece of paper, what the legislation says. So sometimes it takes away the human element of it, because a lot of people haven't faced that, don't have that lived experience themselves. But my story or my journey isn't a one-off, it's happening to so many. So I'm hoping that there are more research projects that come in where they can discuss what's happened to them and how systems can be bettered. The research was done beautifully by the senior research officer at Tenants Vic, and it was done in a way which is very trauma-informed and very non-prejudicial. It's not only a fabulously created and visually very appealing report, but it also highlights what not just me, but so many other single parent renters are facing in Victoria. Sort of being a property manager, and all due respect to them, it's a profession, it's a career that they have. Handing out an eviction notice might just mean a piece of paper for them. But for the tenants living there, the second they get that letter, it just completely distorts their mental well-being. To a single parent family, that eviction notice not only affects the person who's renting, but also any children in their care. I wish there are more steps that a rental provider, housing provider has to take, and they can't just hand out eviction notice willy-nilly, just for a fairer system and a fair go. We live in the land of the fair go. So just a fair go for single parent renters everywhere.
Who is, as you can see, extremely compelling and has a remarkable story to tell about her experience, not only as a recipient of an eviction notice, but her journey to Tenants Victoria and coming out the other side of that process as well. Hannah, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. And maybe you could share some of your insights too from the work that you've done.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lynn. I just want to start first by saying I'm so glad that we started this presentation with that message from Macy, because, you know, that is at the forefront of this research, is giving renters a platform to tell their story and their experiences. And she was, a fantastic person to talk to in discussing this. So, I'm here to discuss some of the key insights from our research report, Restricted, Resilient, Resourceful, Legal Help Seeking Among Single Parent Renters. As mentioned earlier, this research was done with us, Tenants Victoria, and in partnership with Council of Single Mothers and their Children. And it was also funded through a Victoria Law Foundation grant. So what we're going to kind of go through today is I just want to discuss a little bit about, why we spoke to single parents, the research design of this project, some of the key insights that emerged, and then just a brief conclusion. But first, a little bit about us. So yes, we're at Tenants Victoria, we're a statewide community legal centre. We assist Victorian renters through legal support, financial counselling and social work. We also help out in the community through community education, both for renters, but also people who work with renters. And we also work in research, policy, advocacy. So I kind of want to talk first a little about where this research emerged, where the need emerged for us. So Genetics Victoria, this research emerged because we had a look at our own service data, and that data showed that single parents who had contacted us for help, that they reported, lower levels of satisfaction with our services, they accessed our services at a lower rate, and that they were overrepresented in matter types that were more likely to affect housing security. This included rent arrears, family violence, and eviction notices. So once we kind of had a look and realized that we had this problem in our own data, we turned to look at what was happening in the wider legal research community. And we had a look at the legal needs surveys, which included Pulse, of course, and then also going back, having a look at the Legal Australia wide survey. So we found, as Hugh has already kind of mentioned, that there was high overall rates of legal problems, and that those problems are often multiple and they're often persistent. We also found that it's quite difficult for single parents to address renting issues, and this is often due to limited time, limited resources, and importantly, limited appropriate alternative housing options for them to go to. So this is where this research emerged for us. It was in this intersection between these broader findings on legal need among single parents, but it was also a very important moment for us to acknowledge our own shortfalls to meet their service needs. And, this has been a very beneficial exercise for us to do as a legal service. And, I would recommend any other legal service, have a look through your data and see, which groups you might be underserving. So we really wanted to understand, by doing this research, we wanted to understand, how does rental disadvantage, how can it impact single parents? We wanted to know the factors that make seeking assistance when faced with a legal problem more challenging for them. We wanted to know how we could respond better to their needs, as a renter support service, and then, take these insights and, use them to improve future service engagement for single parents, but also for, potentially other groups that might be facing, similar levels or similar issues in the rental market. So next, I'll just have a little discussion around the research design. I'm not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty on it. So what we did, we spoke to 19 single parents who were renting in Victoria. So we wanted to talk to people who had experienced at least one rental legal problem within the past 5 years, and also during a time when they were a single parent. The reason for this is we really wanted to, document the help seeking pathways that these renters were taking when they were faced with that legal problem. But we also wanted to test our legal capability framework, which you'll see up here on the screen, which, kind of looks at the different steps that people take, or the different building blocks people need to, access information, to improve their confidence, take legal action, and then lead to legal resolution. I'll just pause to say that the conceptualization of legal capability in this research was informed by its definition in the Public Understanding of Law survey. So we also defined it as the accumulation of individual skills that people need to identify that the problem has a legal dimension, but that was also in combination with the presence of external structural supports that enable them to engage with legal institutions and services. And these factors, they assist people to exercise their rights and to achieve fair outcomes. However, in testing this framework, which was an important step for us as a service, we found that legal resolution was actually not as linear for renters as these steps would suggest. So the demographics of the parents that we spoke to 17 women and 2 men. It was very important for us to make sure we had at least 80% representation of single mothers in this cohort, because that is the ABS statistic breakdown. So we wanted to make sure we had a good representation of women. The average age of the participants was 45. The number of children living with them, majority had 1 child living with them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had 1 parent who had 6 children living with her. The reported median weekly household before tax was $1,069, which I believe is connected to this next point, which was that 87% of the participants who had reported both their income and their rent in the study were in rental stress, so spending at least 30% or more of their income on rent. This went up to, I believe, one person was spending up to 67% of her income on rent at the time of the study. And the rental type was 15 people in private rentals. There was 2 in informal rental agreements, and then 2 in a community house, so public housing, and 1 in an affordable. There you go. Thank you. So the key insights, we learn a lot through this project. And in the report itself, we outlined 7 key findings. But today, I'd like to talk about the core finding. So the core finding was around the legal capability of single parents. So we found that access to trusted legal information is incredibly important when you're managing legal problems. However, that the levels of legal capability did tend to fluctuate over time for single parents, and this was often because of these intersecting restrictive external factors that was making it difficult for them to engage with their rights, absorb legal information, and then take legal action. So we found as well that what tended to work well was a multidisciplinary service approach that helped people address, their interconnected legal, financial, health, and housing issues. As we know, legal problems rarely occur in isolation, so they often need various supports to help them overcome those issues. So within that core finding, I wanted to take the time in this presentation to just unpack the 3 key factors that were impacting their legal capability and their ability to engage with their rights. So we actually found that the majority of single parents in this research, they were able to identify that there was a legal dimension to their rental issue, and they were often quick to reach out for help. This could be through legal, community, and government services. But we found that the problems were tending to occur when it came to, navigating services and, pushing for their rental issues to be addressed. And that these were often restricted by these 3 main factors. So the power imbalance in the rental market, the restricted access to free legal services, and then challenges retaining and actioning advice. So just to begin, the first one I'll unpack will be the power imbalance in the rental market. So as we know, it's a hyper-competitive rental market that we're in. There is a severe lack of affordable private rentals, and we also combine that with insufficient social housing stock. This means that in this system, that renters are often, they're burdened with the responsibility to take action in a system where they also feel disempowered. So they're often the party who has to, challenge a rent rise or request maintenance and repair issues. So they're often the one that kind of has to take that action step. Before they take that step, they often have to, they have to weigh up multiple factors before deciding what steps they take, if any. And this means that for a lot of them, they're actually quite fearful of taking action. Because, as, Macy was saying, keeping your family housed is often the primary concern. It's your main priority. And you just, you don't want to, often renters don't want to do something that could, potentially lead to retaliation. They don't want to be labeled a problematic tenant, and they don't want to do anything that could impact their ability to then get another rental after whatever they're experiencing at that moment, which means a lot of people, at least private renters, they tend to wait until they have exited the property before, lodging VCAT matters. This was also, you can see here on the screen that 13 single parents, they describe instances where, they raise an issue with, their rental provider, housing provider, or real estate agent. But if they didn't act on it, they didn't push it further. They kind of just let it leave. So the second factor we'll unpack was, the restricted access to free legal services. So this is when, you've experienced your rental problem and then you're ready to reach out for help. Often when you kind of get to this first step, you're met with difficulties, finding support. We're an under-resourced and we're an overextended sector. So we experience, you reach out for support and you often experience long wait times and that there is limited help available. And, this is particularly difficult for people to navigate when they have, time sensitive, complex, or multiple problems. It can be particularly distressing. We found because of that in order to navigate that system, that a lot of help seekers read really strong self-advocacy skills to repeatedly knock on the door for help, which is often something that's required of them. The single parents who participated in this research, they actually displayed incredibly strong, a lot of them displayed incredibly strong self-advocacy skills that were often attained through necessity, through repeated system engagement. However, having to repeatedly ask for help or, go to multiple services often takes its toll on people. So they describe, being redirected to numerous services, having to repeat their stories, and occasionally, still not finding the help that they needed. And for some single parents from this research, they're actually now hesitant to reach out for help with a rental issue through a service because of a previously bad experience, or because they've had negative connotations with navigating other like family law issues or other areas of law. So, we have to acknowledge, as services, we have to acknowledge that the models that we have, they can deter people, especially those who, if they have diminished capacity to self-advocate, if they're already hesitant to access support in a rental crisis, or if they lack the necessary time, skills, or resources that are often needed to navigate across multiple services. So the final factor I'll be unpacking is around the challenges that people often face retaining and actioning advice. So this is once they've gotten through to the service. So for us as legal services, helping people develop their legal knowledge, their confidence, and their literacy is around a really important aspect of our service delivery. We want to, give people the skills that maybe next time they might be able to handle something on their own because we've helped them develop and harness that skill. However, when people come through to us, sometimes they don't have capacity to take on information about their legal problem, which, is very understandable when you're managing an issue that could impact your family's housing security. It can be very distressing for anyone, and particularly for single parents. When you're in that state, it's quite hard to hear, unfamiliar information, and then not only hear that information, but then translate it into action. It just can be quite a complex task, and it can feel very overwhelming. So I wanted to just talk about, in relation to this, one of the renters I spoke to, Bronwyn, that's not her real name, but I wanted to talk about this renter's experience because I think it shows very clearly how much legal capability fluctuates when you're dealing with these issues. So Bronwyn, she actually had very strong legal literacy skills, and she had a really good understanding of, legal frameworks and regulatory bodies. She had worked in the legal sector before. However, when she was faced with, a rental issue, that navigating that really made her feel quite helpless. She was concerned that her family could be at risk of homelessness if she wasn't able to, resolve the issue or find another rental in a short period of time. So these kind of things kind of came together in that moment, and it really clouded her ability to, decide what steps that she actually needed to take in that moment. This is kind of, a very good example of we can build the skills, people can have that knowledge, but then when something comes along and you're not prepared for it, gets you by surprise, that it can really impact your ability to strategize and make those choices. So what we found works well for single parents in these situations was to have, multiple solutions offered, to be able to talk through those options with the service worker, and then have someone reach out after initial contact with follow-up information to, make sure that they had actually taken that information on board. So just in summary, yeah, I feel like these findings, they really demonstrate just how complex it is for single parents to address rental issues. When renters don't have, adequate structural supports available to them, their ability to engage with their rights as renters and seek legal resolution it's severely diminished. So we believe that, greater government investment in legal services is needed to better meet the growing demand for integrated legal assistance. And this could be done through the creation of more legal and non-legal positions, so lawyers, social workers, financial counsellors, etc. We feel that, taking this kind of multidisciplinary approach to legal services provision, that's really key to, reimagining what a successful outcome actually looks for renters facing housing issues, because we can actually meet them where they're at in their journey, not where we expect them to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think the resonances are very, very strong, and I think the experience that you've had together with our understanding at a more macro level around capability that was explored in the Pulse is very striking. We are absolutely looking forward to your questions. So please, if you'd like to put a question in the Q&A function, do that, or upvote someone else's, and we'll get to those in a moment. But we've asked our panelists to ask each other a question so that they get what they want out of each other on this occasion too. So Hugh, I think you've got a question for Hannah.
Yeah, I do. Hannah, research projects often lead to further research questions and studies. Are there any particular issues that you want to follow up on, or things that you want to know more about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, as we always say, yes, it always leads to more research. That's very true. I'll just say that, we found this, it was incredibly beneficial for us to do as a service. We have, new insights that we didn't have before on the pathways that renters take, from finding housing, managing their relationships with their rental provider, housing provider, real estate agent, through to, experiencing that rental issue, seeking help, navigating services and legal systems. It's a really long journey. And it can go, the timeline often changes. And, we've now depicted that in a renter journey map that, just depicts those 6 steps and some of the pain points that renters are experiencing. However, there's a lot of unknowns that we believe require that further investigation that you're talking about. The challenges that single parents face, we believe that they would likely be repeated across other kind of, groups facing similar forms of rental disadvantage. However, there's going to be issues that are going to be unique to other groups, similar as there are issues that are more unique to single parents. And, there's just, a lot of blanks that we can still fill in with more research on these specific groups. But, this could be through, more in-depth research, like the report. But, we could also do it with through, new ways to collect feedback from the people we work with, and, gather deeper understanding of how people, travel through different systems when they go to different services. That service data is invaluable when it's collected well and it's used well.
I think we're very fond of service data. To be honest, it can tell us a great deal. Do you have a question for Hugh?
Yeah, absolutely. I was excited to get the opportunity to ask Hugh a question. So I am going to ask one that I definitely want to know the answer to. So Hugh, I was wondering, so do you have any suggestions on how us as legal services can improve our capacity to not only identify, but also respond to this fluctuating level of legal capability of the people we work with?
I think we're at a really important juncture. So previously, we used to talk about legal capability in some more conceptual terms. We thought this helped us explain people's experience of their access to justice problems and their experience trying to get help to resolve their legal situations. I think with Pulse and the insights that Pulse provides, that's now real. We can see clearly for the first time how legal capability is distributed across the community and how it really affects what people do and what they achieve. So I think we're in a stronger place than we've ever been before to recognise legal capability as a real thing, a real issue. I think you're absolutely right about the dynamism of legal capability, and that's part of the nuanced challenge of responding to it. I would also say we're at an early stage in knowing the best way to respond, or how to best deal with the fluctuating legal capability. I do think your recognition of the service data and the service insights becomes really, really important there, because if we can get a better sense of who's faring better or worse from different types of service models, we can build what we need to do to fill out the evidence base to potentially inform better practice. I think we're at the beginning of that journey and insights, but I also think that's kind of like one of the new frontiers of research going forward. In other places and at other times, I would observe, and might as well do it here, we've had several decades of access to justice reforms. We've strived to do plainer language. We've strived to put in alternative and additional dispute resolution processes. We're now looking to technology and the difference that it might make. But all of those reforms have perhaps, I should also mention law reform. We've had substantive areas of law reform, but all of those reforms have probably been more muted than anybody would have hoped and wanted. And I think it's the new insights around legal capability which helps recognise and understand that. And I think the example of housing issues amongst certain vulnerable groups, such as single parents and other vulnerable renters, particularly in times of housing crisis and cost of living crisis, really shows up some of that legal capability power imbalance between people in the midst of legal problems and legal disputes. So it's an opportunity for us to rethink and reimagine what type of justice system we want to have, what type of services we want to be providing, so that we have, more equal access to justice across the community.
Really interesting. I've got so many thoughts, but if you've got a question, then please put it in the Q&A and we'll get to your questions in just a sec. But your description of the fluctuation of capability, I think, is a really fascinating one. And it would seem to me to resonate very strongly with work that was done a few years ago around guardianship and mental capacity, and how that is seen now and understood to fluctuate over time, and rise and fall in terms of its complexity as well. So I think there's a lot to learn from other sectors around how we understand fluctuation of capacity and capability. But it struck me when you talked, Hannah, about the measures that you've already put in place. So following people up with a call afterwards to just check in and see how they've gone and which option they've decided to pursue, and whether or not they fully understood the options that were available to them. That seems to me to be an intuitive response to fluctuating capability. Is that how you would understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we give this kind of information, it's information as well that is so familiar to the worker who is giving it, they know how to apply it, and they know like what steps to take. And I think, that it's challenging those assumptions around, whether or not someone has, actually absorbed and taken all that information. And, one of those things that's really important when you're looking at whether or not someone is absorbed is looking at, not just the issue that they've come with, but also maybe what else is happening in their life. So it's kind of taking a bit more of a wider lens, so to speak, to the issue, which I think is really where this research was pointing, that it's not just a rental issue, that, renters experience a vast array of issues that impact the work that we do, which is why we've really started moving more towards that, multidisciplinary approach. We now have expanded our social work team, our financial counselling team. They do amazing work. And it's been really fantastic being able to help people across multiple areas of the problem.
I mean, it makes so much sense that a financial counselling offer is hand in glove with housing challenge. We've got a really interesting question which takes that a little bit further around the capacity of CLCs to do that follow-up, because they're often, as we're all aware, very slammed and find it very difficult to follow up with post advice. So the question from Sky is, have you found any light touch ways to check in with clients to reinforce the advice or ensure that it's been received or acted upon that other CLCs could try? So I suppose the key words there are light touch.
Yes. I think it's still something we're grappling with how to implement, because, we've obviously as services, we've got when you have capacity issues, by making up those follow-up calls, it means you might not be able to take more calls coming in when you've got that massive bottleneck of demand coming at you. So I think, what you need to do as a service is put some measures in place around, well, if we make this change, what are we actually hoping to achieve and how are we going to measure that? So I think, it's not just about making the change. I think it's about measuring the impact of the change itself and seeing if it's doing what you're intended to do. And if you can work it into your capacity, or maybe you need to get more funding.
There's the perennial question. A really interesting question from Jocasta as well, who congratulates you both on the work. But she's particularly interested, Hannah, in understanding a bit more about how you landed, I think, on this area to focus on. So why, or what was it that came out of your own insights into the traffic through your own service that prompted you to undertake this research?
Yeah, so it was definitely, it actually came from our renter feedback surveys, was where it initially started. So they were reporting lower service satisfaction. There was all these things they were down on, but they were also down on the people that were coming. It wasn't matching up. So it was, I think we kind of saw it as an important opportunity to, investigate into what are the unique barriers that single parents are facing, and use that as a tool to investigate wider issues at the same time, because, by extrapolation, a lot of people are going to be facing these same issues. So any changes that we make as a service to better accommodate single parents
are
likely to have good impact across other groups as well. So I think sometimes it is very beneficial to focus in on one specific group in order to make wider, more beneficial changes rather than trying to solve everything at once.
Yes. And especially given all our constrained resources.
Yes.
Another interesting dimension on capability, a question from a person who's asking about the prospect of retaliation and how constraining that is. And does that actually block capability in a very, fundamental way and prevent people from even thinking about, taking further action?
Yes, absolutely.
I think we don't.
Yes.
That's the case.
I think particularly for private renters, that was an issue. It's also a concern, as we'll see from Macy's experience with the community housing, but they do, the private renters, it's much easier for them to lose their house than it is in community and social housing, as that was something that Macy had told me in the interviews. So I think, yes, for private renters, it is a much more significant concern. How we combat that as a service is unclear because it's a little bit out of our control. But we did find one of the findings from the research was around the important role of the relationships between renters and their, the housing provider, the rental provider, and the real estate agent. If it's working well and everyone's doing their part and taking on their responsibility, it stops that legal help seeking journey from even having to begin, because people are they're taking care of their responsibilities that they need to take care of. So I think that was an important dimension that we hadn't really kind of gone deep into yet, but oh yes, like this, you know, how do we, you know, impact that? How do we create
Yes.
better education and reform in that area? I think is important.
And you mentioned before the webinar started that particularly in regional parts of Victoria, the retaliation issue can be particularly acute
Yes.
because there may be only one provider, maybe only one agent. So your retaliation risk is heightened even further.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And there's also, you know, there's can be less housing stock
Yeah.
available as well. There's also other dimensions around, you know, if, you know, the fires, floods, that those kind of additionals, again, those take a different group, apply a different lens. It's those additional structural and environmental challenges that really impact people's legal capability. So I think, yeah, those are looking at the different areas and how that's playing out is also really important as well, because it definitely impacts, you know, people's willingness to take action as well.
One of the questions we had earlier here was around the demography of these kinds of problems. So younger people and older people, and whether or not elder abuse came into play as, you know, a dimension of a housing issue for older people. Does the work go to that?
It can do, and some of the things I didn't talk about today, which will be in the paper that eventually gets published, will break down some of those demographics more clearly. I mean, I think housing status in itself has got an age dimension to it. Younger people tend to be renters in more precarious housing situation. It's older people who tend to have paid off their mortgage. And
we
sort
also
of what
know
we
that the greatest increase in homelessness is women
Yeah.
55 plus.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I think that is, as the research would suggest, that is a new phenomena in our society, and one that we've probably failed to tackle to this point.
are you seeing that come through, Hannah, that you're aware of, that older demographic?
Well, we certainly get more in our current renter feedback processes. There, we get a lot more data and feedback from older renters. But yeah, it's not something that came up in my research per se. But yeah, so I don't know if I can really speak to that one.
No, fair enough, fair enough. I'm going to lift this up because it's a bit easier to read this way, so forgive me, everyone. Ben has thanked us, and his comment question: from a research perspective, it's important to ask at what point do problems stop being legal issues, capacity, agency, capability, and instead reveal themselves as symptoms of deeper economic or structural failures. How can we show with evidence that legal problems are really desperate responses to an underlying economic problem that requires an economic solution? Without recognizing housing as a human right, these issues may never be properly addressed, at least in this space. And I think we would probably all agree that in the broader context, this is absolutely on point. Have you got thoughts on that, Hugh?
Oh, I think the findings of this type of research of Hannah's research really brings to life the human, the civil legal need, the human rights dimension of these issues, and I think it becomes a fundamental thing to be thinking about the structure of our society, of our economy, and the nature of the society we want to be living in. So, is it a canary? It's just another canary in the coal mine. And I think this type of research also shows up the limits of our justice system as being that safety net for the whole community. I don't think we can just sit back and expect the justice system to magically solve
the fundamental economic inequities that we're living with.
For the issues, and yeah, the other types of actions and solutions and policy are going to be part of the solution.
Wow. Okay, there's an agenda for our next conversation. Thank you both very, very much indeed. Hugh McDonald from the VLF and Hannah Gray from Tenants Victoria. Really interesting research, and we look forward to the paper that will come from the Pulse Research, and yours is available online
Yes, it's
at
available.
Pennants Vic, and it's, as Macy put it so well, beautifully presented and a great read. So I recommend it to everyone. I'd also really like to thank Macy for making herself available for that short video. It was wonderful to get her perspective on this really pressing issue. And to thank also Jackie Matthews and Leon Meyer for their technical wizardry in making today happen, to Vicky Doig for her outstanding coordination and wrangling of us, the team at the City Library for their hospitality, and to you for coming along and for your questions and your ongoing support. And don't forget, we'll have another Research Network event in the not too distant. So sign up if you haven't already, subscribe to our information, and we will keep you posted on the next topic and date and time. So look forward to your company then, and have a lovely afternoon. Thanks.